What can a 45,000-year-old bone tell us? More than we ever imagined. In the last 2 decades, ancient DNA has transformed archaeology. We no longer just dig up bones, we decode their memories. Inside every fossil lies a molecular record of migrations, encounters, and even forgotten lineages that once shaped the human story. One such fossil was pulled from the frozen banks of the Irtysh River in western Siberia. It was a single femur, just a leg bone, lying undisturbed in the permafrost. But that bone belonged to a man who lived at a pivotal moment in human prehistory, after Homo sapiens had left Africa, but before they had truly become Europeans, Asians, or Native Americans. A time when we were still becoming us. His name, at least what we call him now, is the Ust-Ishim man, and he holds a unique place in our species' story. He is, to date, the oldest modern human ever to have his entire genome sequenced, not because he founded a great civilization or left behind tools of genius, but simply because his bones were preserved and his DNA survived. He has no known descendants. No tribe, no culture, no oral history remembers him. And yet, through the silent language of his genes, he speaks. He tells us not who we are, but what we were, just before the world split into separate peoples. To understand what makes him so extraordinary, we need to go back, not just in time, but across the landscape, to the icy soils of western Siberia, where this mystery truly begins. When scientists sequenced the genome of the Ust-Ishim man, one number stood out: 2.3%. That's the percentage of Neanderthal DNA woven into his chromosomes, a genetic signature shared by nearly every human today who isn't of purely African ancestry. But in his case, those Neanderthal traces weren't just a faint whisper from the distant past. They were loud, long, and remarkably intact. Here's why that matters. Over time, the DNA we inherit from ancient ancestors gets chopped up and shuffled, like an old book falling apart page by page with every generation. The Neanderthal segments in modern humans are fragmented, scattered. But in Ust-Ishim, those segments were still relatively long and contiguous, suggesting the encounter between his ancestors and Neanderthals wasn't that far behind him. In fact, using the length of those DNA chunks as a kind of molecular clock, researchers estimate that the interbreeding event happened just 7,000 to 13,000 years before he lived. That puts the likely date of this ancient rendezvous between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals at around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, probably somewhere in the Middle East. Right where early modern humans would have been passing through after leaving Africa, and right where Neanderthals had been for hundreds of thousands of years. Was it a fleeting meeting? A long cohabitation? We'll never know the emotional details, but biologically, the results were lasting. And Ust-Ishim carries the proof in every cell. Interestingly, he wasn't the only one. Another ancient human known as Oase-1, discovered in Romania, also had Neanderthal DNA. But the pattern was different. Oase-1's genome contained an unusually high percentage of Neanderthal ancestry, concentrated in just a few spots, suggesting he may have had a great-great-grandparent who was fully Neanderthal. That's a personal story. Ust-Ishim's story is broader. His Neanderthal DNA wasn't a family quirk, it was community-wide inheritance. He represents a population that had already merged, at least partially, with their Neanderthal cousins. So what does that make him? A modern human, yes, but one who stood at a genetic crossroads, anatomically Homo sapiens, genetically still echoing another species. A hybrid, in the truest sense of the word. And yet, he was only one path among many. To understand where that path led or didn't, we need to look around him. To the others who lived, walked, and evolved across Eurasia during those same millennia, some left descendants. Others, like him, left questions. Evolution doesn't leave roadmaps. It leaves breadcrumbs. When early Homo sapiens began spreading out of Africa roughly 60,000 years ago, they didn't march in a neat, orderly fashion across the globe. They split, wandered, branched, and more often than not, disappeared. But occasionally, just occasionally, we stumble upon two fossilized humans who help us see the shape of those ancient divergences. Meet Tianyuan Man. He lived about 40,000 years ago, near what is now Beijing, China. Just 5,000 years younger than Ust-Ishim, but genetically, they stand on opposite sides of a deep fork in the human tree. Genetic analysis shows that Tianyuan Man is more closely related to present-day East Asians and indigenous peoples of the Americas than to Europeans. His genome already carries the signature of an emerging lineage one that would survive and flourish across the eastern parts of Eurasia and beyond. In contrast, Ust-Ishim belonged to a more basal branch, a group of humans who hadn't yet split into the east-west divide. Think of him as standing right at the edge of the decision point, before humanity began to take regional shapes. He was part of a wave that ventured deep into Eurasia, and then, seemingly, vanished. They were both modern humans, both participants in that grand migration out of Africa. And yet their legacies diverged. Tianyuan Man contributed to living populations. Ust-Ishim didn't. No descendants, no cultural lineage. His DNA is a historical bookmark, fascinating, but not followed by any chapters. So what happened? Perhaps his group was too small. Perhaps they were absorbed by later arrivals. Or perhaps they simply lost the evolutionary lottery. A common fate in prehistory, where survival wasn't just about strength, but timing, climate, and sheer dumb luck. And yet, these two men, one from the icy forests of Siberia, the other from the river valleys of East Asia, represent more than bones and base pairs. They frame the moment when human diversity first began to take shape. When Homo sapiens stopped being one big wandering family and started becoming something more complex and more familiar. It's also a reminder. Our genetic story is not a ladder, it's a braid. Twisted, knotted, sometimes frayed. The fact that Tianyuan's DNA still flows in modern people, while Ust-Ishim's does not, doesn't make one more important than the other. It just makes the picture clearer. But Ust-Ishim's chapter isn't closed yet. If you think of ancient Siberia as a frozen, empty no-man's land, think again. Far from being an isolated frontier, Siberia was once a bustling highway of human ancestry. Not bustling with cities, of course, but with waves of migrating peoples, overlapping lineages, and silent exchanges of DNA that would ripple across continents. It wasn't the end of the human journey. It was the middle and sometimes the meeting point. Ust-Ishim, remember, may not have left descendants, but he belonged to a population that did a group that served as a kind of genetic bridge between East and West. And echoes of that group can still be found today, hidden in the DNA of modern Siberians, including groups like the Evenks, Yakuts, and Buryats. A recent genome-wide study revealed something remarkable. Up to 38% of their ancestry can be traced back to an Ust-Ishim-like population. That's not trivial. It suggests that although the man himself was a genetic dead end, his cousins, his people, kept walking, kept surviving, kept mixing. Even more astonishing? That same genetic signal reaches all the way into the Americas. Through a branch of ancient humans known as the ancient North Eurasians, individuals like Malta Boy, 24,000 years old, and a Fontova Gora too, 17,000 years old, carried a blend of Western Eurasian and Ust-Ishim-related DNA. Their genes would later pass into the ancestors of Native Americans, meaning that the genomic legacy of Siberia stretches not just east and west, but all the way across the Bering Strait. Siberia, in other words, was never just a frozen outpost. It was a genetic junction box where lineages from Europe, Asia, and ancient ghost populations crossed wires, exchanged code, and set the foundations for peoples far beyond their icy borders. This mosaic of migrations makes it nearly impossible to speak of any one ancestry in simple terms. In prehistoric Siberia, almost everyone was part something else. The past wasn't pure. It was mixed from the start, and Ust-Ishim, though quiet, was there in the middle of it all, an early node in a complex network of ancestry that continues to connect us, whether we realize it or not. But what did he look like, this man from the crossroads? Could we recognize him today on the street, in a photo, in the mirror? Let's see what his DNA can tell us. Not just about where he came from, but who he might have been. He left no portraits, no carvings, no cave art, not even a crude self-portrait scratched into bone. And yet, thanks to the quiet precision of DNA, we can now form a surprisingly vivid image of the man who lived 45,000 years ago in Siberia. Spoiler, he probably wouldn't look out of place in a chilly forest today. Ust-Ishim's genome reveals that he likely had a medium to dark skin tone, somewhere between tan and olive, well suited for a world with moderate UV exposure, but biting cold. Not quite the sun-baked skin of equatorial ancestors, and not yet the pale tone that would emerge in later European populations. Light skin, blue eyes, and blonde hair? Those features didn't exist yet. In fact, the mutations associated with them wouldn't evolve until thousands of years later, shaped by new climates and changing diets. His eyes were probably brown, his hair black and straight, and his face broad and robust, traits still commonly found today across Central and Northeast Asia. In short, if he time-traveled to a modern-day Siberian village and threw on a parka, he might not draw a second glance, except maybe for not having an ID. From a genetic lineage perspective, Ust-Ishim carried a Y chromosome haplogroup that today branches into what we now call haplogroups N and O. That's not just alphabet soup, it means his male line ancestry would eventually split to form two major lineages, one still common among Siberian and Uralic-speaking populations, the other dominant in much of East Asia. So while he himself may have left no direct descendants, the genetic branch he stood on continues to grow quietly, stubbornly, and across thousands of kilometers. It's a bit poetic, really. A man who lived before borders, before nations, before recorded history, yet whose biological footprint lives on in millions of people who've never heard his name. And if you could somehow look him in the eye, those dark Neanderthal-tinted eyes, you might wonder how much of his world still lingers in ours. But of course, looks aren't the whole story. History tends to remember victors, dynasties, and names carved into stone. But DNA doesn't work that way. It remembers differently. The Ust-Ishim man belonged to a lineage that, as far as we can tell, didn't survive as a distinct population. No tribe claims him. No language descends from his. And yet, he was not erased. Instead, he represents what geneticists call a ghost lineage, a branch of the human family tree that seems to vanish, yet leaves behind a quiet legacy buried in the genomes of others. We now know that parts of his population cousins, perhaps distant kin, contributed genes to modern Siberians. They passed fragments of their DNA into indigenous peoples of the Americas, via ancient North Eurasians who crisscrossed Siberia in the millennia that followed. It's a subtle kind of immortality, not through memory, but through molecules. Ust-Ishim didn't lead an empire, invent a tool, or write anything down, but his genome helps redefine how we think about our origins. He shows us that human history isn't a straight line, but rather a network, a web of branchings, collisions, and quiet disappearances, woven together across space and time. Some lineages endured, others blinked out. But even those that vanished left fingerprints, and it's worth remembering. If not for chance preservation in a frozen riverbank, his entire existence might have remained unknown. The only reason we know him is because he died in just the right place, and we had the tools to listen. So what does that make him? A founder? A relic? Or something more complicated? Perhaps Ust-Ishim is best understood not as an ancestor, but as a mirror, a reminder that even forgotten lives can echo across millennia, that every genome is a palimpsest, layered with the stories of people who never made it into the textbooks. And maybe, just maybe, some part of him still walks among us. A single gene, tucked deep inside a Siberian herder. A strand of DNA quietly riding the bloodstream of someone in Alaska. Or perhaps, even you. Because the strangest thing about Ust-Ishim is this: he's gone. And yet, we know him better than many who came after. And that, in itself, is a legacy.